Have you ever felt like you were screaming to the sky and heard nothing in response? Have you ever knelt down with your heart in pieces, hoping God would say something, anything, but all you got was silence? There are moments in life when the sky feels distant, as if our prayers are lost in the wind. It's on these days that the chest tightens, faith trembles, and God's silence becomes almost unbearable. Many families go through this: unexplained pain, unanswered prayers, tears that no one sees. And even knowing He is in control, why does it feel like He's silent? Take a deep breath now and think, have you ever felt this way? God's silence hurts more than a no answer, because at least a no gives us direction, it positions us. But silence, it leaves us in the dark, walking through an emotional maze where our steps seem to make no sound. And it's precisely in these moments that the most dangerous thoughts arise. Has God abandoned me? Did I do something wrong? Has He forgotten about my house? These aren't empty questions. They are cries from those who are tired, waiting for a sign. How many mothers cry for their children? How many fathers pray for provision? And nothing changes. Does God see? Picture yourself in this scene, sitting at the table, the overdue bill in hand, the fridge nearly empty, and your children asking if everything is okay. You say yes, but inside you're screaming for help that hasn't come. And at night, when everyone is asleep, you pray softly, pleading for direction. But God remains silent. This silence isn't just spiritual. It echoes in the walls of your soul. And even knowing all the comforting verses by heart, it feels like none of them can warm your heart in that moment. Have you ever lived through this kind of silence? Maybe you can't explain it, but you feel like you're being tested, as if there's something behind this pain, but you still don't understand why. And that hurts even more, because you've always been faithful, always prayed, always taught your children to trust in God. But now, in the moment you need Him most, He is quiet. And that stillness bothers you, because we are taught to wait for miracles, for voices from above, for signs. But there are times when all we have is the sound of our own cry muffled by the pillow. Don't blame yourself for feeling this way. Even the most God-fearing men and women in the Bible went through that dark valley where the sky closes and the soul grows weary. Job, for example, knew God, walked in righteousness, did everything right, and yet he faced the deepest silence. A faithful servant could know. This shows us that suffering is not always punishment, and silence is not always disapproval. Sometimes it's the stage prepared for a kind of faith that only emerges in pain. And this kind of faith can't be taught, it must be lived. There is a type of silence that teaches, that doesn't answer, but shapes. God doesn't speak, but He is watching. And while we pray with tears, He is drawing something invisible to our eyes. But knowing this doesn't always bring immediate comfort, because the pain still pulses, the waiting still suffocates, and the days seem to drag on. What do we do when our heart is restless and the sky is silent? Keep trusting, keep moving forward, or stop and wait, even though we don't know for how long? This is the tension of faith that many of us live, even within our homes. Right now, maybe you're sitting there trying to understand what God is doing, or why He seems to be doing nothing. Maybe you've already said, "Lord, just give me a sign, a whisper, anything." But all you get is silence. And it's in this kind of silence that the deepest journey of the soul begins, because it's not just about what we feel, but about who we choose to believe in. And it was in this dark place of loss and silence that a man named Job began to live the most difficult and most transformative chapter of his story. Before the storm there was calm. Job lived in days of abundance, respect, and peace. He was known for his integrity, not just for the possessions he had, but for his upright heart before God. He was the kind of man who inspired trust in his community, someone others turned to when they needed advice or wisdom. And more than that, Job was a man of faith, not just in words, but in the way he lived, treated people, took care of his home, and revered God with fear. There was honor in his words, and his actions reflected heaven. He had everything many would consider a blessed life: fertile fields, servants, riches, and a large family. 10 children around the table, sharing laughter, meals, and moments of fellowship. Job not only provided food, he nourished the faith of those around him with acts of reverence and love. It was common to see him offering sacrifices for each of his children, in case any of them had even unknowingly offended God in thought or action. He interceded, he cared, he was a present, spiritual, and prudent father. And for Job, this was a priority. Put yourself in the place of this family. Imagine your children growing up in a home where faith was not just a speech on Saturday or Sunday, but a daily living practice, where prayers were not a duty, but a reflection of gratitude, where faith was visible in the way the father treated the servants, the neighbors, the weaker ones. This was the environment of Job's house, and that's why his family prospered, not just financially, but emotionally. It was a home with structure, with principles, with deep spiritual roots. Everything seemed stable until the wind began to change. Even with all his prosperity, Job was not a man bound to wealth. His trust was firmly placed in God, not in the possessions he had. This made him different. He understood that everything came from the Lord's hands, and that's why he lived with reverence, humility, and surrender. It's hard to find such an example today. A man who had everything but wasn't a slave to anything. He used his resources for good, for justice, to honor God's name. And that made him a living testimony, a reference for his generation. But what few saw was how much Job cared for the invisible, for the intentions of the heart, the thoughts that couldn't be read by men, but were transparent before God. He took spiritual life seriously, not because he wanted rewards, but because he knew who God was. This made his faith solid, constant, real. He didn't serve God out of fear, nor for personal gain. He served because he loved him. And this kind of faith, so rare, was exactly what made Job's life so special in the eyes of heaven. In his daily routine, Job also took care of the needy. He reached out to the poor, welcomed strangers, and was just with everyone. What he had didn't blind him. On the contrary, it made him even more aware of his responsibility before God. His children grew up seeing this example, and that's why, for Job, what mattered most wasn't the size of his wealth, but the preservation of the fear of the Lord within his home. He didn't let prosperity weaken his devotion. He was a complete man, in the eyes of men, and even more, in the eyes of God. But heaven, which sees all, knows the deepest intentions of the heart. And even in the face of such a righteous life, an invisible conversation was unfolding in the spiritual backdrop, something Job could not foresee nor understand. And so it was at the peak of stability, when everything seemed perfect, that the story took a turn, because there are moments when even the most righteous face the inexplicable. And that's how the most painful chapter of the life of the man who loved God with all his heart began. There is a deep mystery that we don't always understand. Why does God allow the righteous to suffer? Job had done nothing wrong. There was no hidden sin, no disobedience. But even so, in the invisible realm of heaven, something was happening. A conversation between God and Satan placed Job in the center of a trial that no human would easily comprehend. It wasn't punishment, it was purpose, a purpose that transcends human reasoning, but was permitted by God himself. And this confronts us with a harsh truth. Not always is pain a sign of wrongdoing. Satan did not choose Job by chance. He knew who Job was. He knew of his faithfulness, his righteousness, his firm faith even in good times. And it was exactly because of this that he questioned God. Does Job fear you for nothing? As if saying that his faith was selfish, built on blessings. God knew the heart of his servant and understood there was something much deeper there. So he allowed it. He didn't cause it, but he permitted it, as if to say, you may touch everything he has, but not his life. And so, without Job knowing, his story would take an unexpected turn. It happened from one day to the next. Suddenly, the messengers began arriving with news that tore the soul apart. The oxen were taken. The servants were killed. The sheep were burned by fire from heaven. The camels were looted. And finally, as the most devastating pain of all, his children, 10 children, all in one house, a strong wind, a sudden tragedy, and everything turned to silence. The kind of silence that crushes. The kind of silence that is incomprehensible. Job fell to the ground. But up to this point, his faith was still standing, even though the ground was no longer beneath him. Take a moment to place yourself in the heart of this father. Imagine seeing everything you've built, everything you love, being ripped away before your eyes and with no explanation. The feeling of helplessness, the spiritual confusion, the suffocated cry of the soul. And all of this without a single answer. Because until that moment, God was silent. No explanation came from heaven, no vision, no angel, no immediate comfort. Just the echo of pain and the absence of meaning. And yet even in pain, Job declared, "The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." But the enemy did not stop there. He wanted more. He wanted to touch his health, his body, his dignity, and once again God permitted it. You may touch everything, but do not take his life. And then came the sores, tumors, open wounds, unbearable itching. Job found himself isolated, despised, sitting in ashes, scraping his wounds with shards of pottery. The one who was once respected by all was now avoided. His suffering had become physical, visible, humiliating, and God's silence continued. In moments like these, it's inevitable to ask, why? How is it possible for someone so righteous, so faithful, to be crushed by such deep pain? But Job didn't know that his life was a testimony before heaven and earth. He didn't know his trial had an eternal purpose. And maybe you don't know either. Maybe you're living a pain without explanation, wondering where God is. And like Job, you're feeling nothing but silence. But there is something happening that you cannot yet see, and heaven has not lost control. Job's life was being shaken in every way. His soul, wounded. His mind, confused. His body, battered. His house, empty. His faith, tested. And even without understanding why, even without answers, he still resisted. But the trial was far from over, because now words would come that, instead of comforting, would hurt even more. Friends would arrive, but not with empathy. And so, a new chapter of this pain would begin, where judgment replaces the embrace, and guilt is cast upon someone who just wanted to hear, "I'm here with you." There is no sound more terrifying than the silence of a house that was once full of life. Job, the man who was once surrounded by laughter, hugs, and the warmth of his children, now heard only the sound of his own groaning. The silence was so heavy that it felt tangible. It was the echo of mourning, of longing, of the absence that screams inside. Every corner of the house carried a memory, every object a pain, and the emptiness wasn't just around him, it was also inside him. Job's physical wounds were visible, open, inflamed, painful, but the wounds of his soul, those couldn't be measured. The mourning for his children, the loss of everything he had built, the abandonment of those who once respected him, and the silence of God. He sat in the dust, covered in ashes, unable to understand how everything had collapsed so quickly. And in the midst of all this, not a single explanation from heaven, just the crushing weight of suffering, a suffering that silences even the strongest, even the most faithful. Job no longer resembled who he once was. The respected man had become an object of astonishment. Those who once applauded him now avoided him. His wife, consumed by pain, said, "Curse your God and die." It wasn't contempt, it was desperation. She had also lost everything, but Job didn't respond with anger. He simply remained silent. Because there are pains so deep that even love cannot explain. There are moments when faith doesn't shout. It just breathes silently, trying to survive. Take a deep breath and imagine for a moment being covered in wounds, your body on fire, and still remembering the names of the children who are no longer there. Remembering the voices, the laughter, the birthdays, the family prayers, and now all of that has turned into memory. Job was in ruins, on the outside and on the inside, and the heaven that once seemed so near now seemed distant. He looked up and saw no answer, just a closed sky, just a silence that hurt more than any words. Humiliation was daily. People whispered, the looks judged. The reputation built over a lifetime turned to dust in a matter of days. Job didn't ask for this war. He didn't provoke this desert. But there he was, facing a storm he didn't know when would end. And, maybe just like him, you are also facing a season where nothing makes sense, where all that remains is pain, silence, and the hope that God is still listening. He didn't revolt. He didn't give in to blasphemy, but he also no longer had the strength to sing. Job was in a place where faith is not made of beautiful words but of resistance. Sav waking up day after day without understanding, but continuing to breathe, even without answers, even without comfort. Because sometimes all we can do is exist, and for God that is also faith. Even the silent faith of those who no longer have the strength to speak but refuse to give up. And as time passed, Job's soul sank deeper into anguish. There was no rest, no respite. His days were long, his nights endless. What was once honor became shame. What was once peace became inner war. And what was once communion with God now seemed distance. But what Job didn't know yet, and what many of us also don't know in dark days, is that the silence of God is never a sign of abandonment. There is something behind the silence, but this would only be revealed later. Job raised his voice to the heavens. He didn't ask for his riches back, didn't demand detailed explanations. He simply wanted an answer, a sign, a whisper from God. But nothing came. Just the same silence that had been with him for days, the silence that cuts deeper than any cruel word. He had already endured the pain in his body, the loss of his children, the humiliation from his friends, but now he faced the silence from the one he loved most, God himself. There is a kind of pain that only those close to God truly understand. It's not the pain of physical loss, but the pain of praying and hearing nothing in response, of crying out with all your soul and not feeling even a shred of relief in your heart. Job was at that point. The one who once walked with God was now asking where he was. It was as if heaven was locked up tight, as if every word uttered in prayer fell into an empty void. And that hurts more than any visible wound. Have you ever been in that place? Have you ever knelt with tears in your eyes and felt that God simply didn't respond? It's in this moment that faith becomes more than just theory, when the verses that once comforted seem ineffective, when the praise sounds distant, and when your heart asks, fearful of the answer, has God forgotten me? That's exactly how Job felt, not rejected by God, but ignored by him. And that hurt. With every unanswered cry, Job's soul was stirred. He didn't want to debate theology. He just wanted to understand why. Why so much suffering? Why such loss? Why the God who always spoke now silent? The silence became unbearable. There was no hidden sin. There was no disobedience. Yet still God did not speak. And when God is silent, even the strongest of men bend in weakness. Even the most constant of the faithful tremble on the inside. Job's faith began to waver. Not because he stopped loving God, but because his human heart was wounded. Wounded by the absence of divine comfort. Wounded by still believing in a God who wasn't responding. There's no shame in admitting it. God's silence shakes us. It makes us rethink everything. It makes us wonder if we are truly being seen. Because when everything falls apart and God doesn't speak, pain mixes with confusion. And this mixture is a dangerous storm. Still, Job didn't blaspheme. He questioned, yes, he shouted, he mourned, he opened his soul. But he never completely abandoned his faith. Even though it was cracked, even though it was in tatters, it was still there. Because true faith isn't just made of songs and celebrations. It's also made of dark nights, suffocated prayers, unanswered doubts. Job was living exactly that. A faith without guarantees, a trust that, though wounded, still refused to die. But the crisis didn't end there. Job's heart was at a point where even life itself seemed meaningless. He even wished he had never been born. The suffering blinded him, and the silence of God, which should have comforted, became an unbearable weight. He didn't know, and sometimes we don't know either, that something is being worked out in that silence. But for now, Job could only see the pain of one who cries out and hears no answer. Job was at the bottom of the pit, not only physically but spiritually. His pain was deep and he could hardly see beyond his own suffering. But around him, voices began to rise. They weren't just the words of the wind, but those of the friends he trusted, who came to comfort him and instead accused him. Accusations disguised as advice, but only increasing his burden. They didn't understand, and that made everything even harder. Job's friends, in their attempt to help him, began to suggest that he had sinned. "You must have done something wrong," they said with stern looks. "God wouldn't do this to a righteous man," they insisted. They didn't see the bigger picture. They only saw the suffering and, like many, attributed the pain to something Job must have done to deserve it. But Job knew there was nothing in his heart that justified such punishment. God's silence wasn't the answer he had hoped for, but the voices around him didn't stop there. Job's wife, in her despair, suggested he abandon his faith. "Why do you still insist on believing in a God who doesn't respond?" she asked. She, who had also lost everything, no longer saw any value in faith. "Curse God and die," she said, with a tone of desperation and frustration. The suffering had weakened her to the point where she could no longer see the God of hope. To her, the only way out was to give up. These voices, coming from people who loved Job, made the journey even harder. The pain of hearing that he deserved the suffering, or that his faith no longer made sense, was something no one should ever experience. Not only was the physical and emotional pain consuming him, but the mental exhaustion was as well. The words of his friends, who thought themselves righteous and correct, attacked him like sharp spears. Their misguided judgment made the crisis even deeper, and he began to question his own identity. How often, in times of suffering, do the words of others drive us further from God? The advice from those who don't understand our pain and the accusations disguised as help can shift our gaze from Christ and make us feel more alone than ever. When friends fail to offer support and the wife loses hope, what is left? The feeling that everyone around us seems to have turned away from faith, and we're left not knowing where to go. Job, in the midst of emotional chaos, found himself surrounded by wrong voices, those that, instead of helping, only pushed him. closer to the abyss of doubt. He had the option to listen and give in to those influences, but something inside him still resisted. Even in the midst of pain and loneliness, he knew that the only voice that truly mattered in the end was God's. But how could he hear God's voice in the midst of so many others echoing so distortedly? The worst part was that, while his soul cried out for answers, the voices around him seemed to multiply. The words of his friends and his wife were not help, but a temptation to give up. Give up his faith. Give up continuing to seek God. But in that moment, Job still didn't know that the greatest test of his faith was yet to come. A test that would only be overcome if he ignored those wrong voices and remained firm in the truth he still believed. Job, increasingly consumed by pain, began to question himself internally. The question echoing in his mind was inevitable. Where is God? He felt abandoned, as if the Lord had turned away from him in his moment of greatest need. His reason cried out for logical answers, something that could explain the suffering he was enduring. The silence of God, which seemed to be an answer, only fueled his despair. But on the other hand, something inside him, a silent and powerful voice, refused to give up his faith. Job's internal battle grew more intense. He tried to understand the logic behind what was happening, but nothing made sense. He could no longer see God's hand in his life. But despite everything, he knew that to blaspheme against God would be to turn away from what he had always believed. Pain blinded him, but faith still sustained him, though it was a nearly invisible thread. He didn't want to abandon what had always been his truth, but the weight of pain and the lack of answers made him feel as though his faith was being dragged into the abyss. Job wasn't just dealing with physical wounds, but with a deep emotional and spiritual dilemma. The external pain mixed with the internal pain of not understanding God's silence. He had been a just and upright man, but now he felt betrayed by God himself. Reason told him that something was wrong, that he didn't deserve this. But his faith, as fragile as it was at that moment, still fought to remain steadfast. He was on the edge of either giving in to despair or continuing to trust in God. This conflict between reason and faith is not something exclusive to Job. How many times do we feel lost in the midst of suffering and at the same time find ourselves tempted to question God's presence? Physical pain is just the tip of the iceberg. The real battle happens in the soul. The human mind, faced with inexplicable suffering, tends to search for logical reasons, but faith calls us to trust even when we don't see or understand. This is Job's dilemma, a man constantly struggling to maintain his faith while reason tries to steal his hope. Job's crisis of faith wasn't just about the suffering itself, but about the fear of losing everything he believed in. Reason made him wonder if God truly existed, or if his faith was just an illusion fed by the good experiences of the past. But no matter how hard he tried to deny it, the cry for answers from God continued. He didn't want to give in to the temptation to turn away from God, but at the same time pain pushed him toward the edge of the abyss. He was in a limbo between the reason that questioned him and the faith that called him not to give up. Deep down, Job knew that if he blasphemed against God, he would be destroying everything he had built throughout his life. Yet, suffering was pushing him to the limit. He felt as if he were living a nightmare from which he could not wake up. But deep within his soul, one certainty remained. He could not abandon his faith. The internal battle between his reason, which cried out for logical answers, and his faith, which demanded trust, consumed him in a way he had never imagined before. Job found himself between two options: surrender to the pain and anger, or continue trusting in a God who seemingly remained silent. What he didn't know was that the true spiritual battle was just beginning. Each unanswered question, each divine silence, was a test of his faith. Job didn't want to blaspheme, but his soul was being consumed by a pain that made him question everything he believed. The dilemma was deep, and the line between faith and reason was becoming thinner and thinner. Job was on the edge of a spiritual abyss. His mind was tormented, and the weight of the pain seemed unbearable. He had questioned everything, even the very purpose of his existence, but something inside him still resisted. When all seemed lost, a small flame of hope began to shine in his heart. It was at that moment that he declared, with a silent but powerful conviction, "I know that my Redeemer lives." These words, even without an answer from God, echoed as an irrevocable decision to trust despite all his pain. There was no logical explanation for Job's suffering, but he decided that, despite not understanding, he would trust God. He no longer felt God's presence beside him, but the choice to trust did not depend on a momentary feeling. It was a decision based on the conviction that God was still in control, even in the midst of chaos. Job was beginning to understand that true faith is not based on answers, but on an unwavering trust in the character of God, who remains faithful, even when everything around us falls apart. The turning point was not a moment of immediate relief from physical pain, but it was a decisive moment in Job's soul. He no longer felt comfortable, but his faith matured in an unexpected way. He had been purified by pain, and now he was starting to realize that true faith is one that persists even when there is no visible answer. He was no longer seeking explanations, but surrendering his life to the purpose of a God who, though silent, was still trustworthy. With these words, Job took a different stance. He was no longer focusing on what he had lost, but on what could not be taken away: his trust in God. The pain was still there, and God's silence still surrounded him. But now he was determined to trust without needing an immediate answer. This moment was the turning point from a childlike faith, which only believed while blessings were abundant, to a mature faith that stands firm regardless of circumstances. Job was no longer seeking justifications for what was happening to him. He had accepted that pain was part of the process and that, despite God's silence, his faith should be rooted in something deeper. His declaration of faith was not a denial of pain or suffering, but an affirmation that, even in the face of adversity, he knew that God was greater than any circumstance. This moment was decisive in Job's inner transformation, as he realized that true faith does not depend on understanding, but on trusting in God. The act of trusting without understanding was a radical surrender. Job was placing all his certainties in something he could neither see nor feel at the moment. He knew his life was in God's hands, and even without the answers, he knew the Lord had not abandoned him. He was, in some way, willing to remain faithful regardless of the circumstances. In that instant, Job reached a deep understanding that true faith is one that is forged in pain, not in ease. Job's words, "I know that my Redeemer lives," were not just a comfort, but a declaration of battle. In his essence, he was deciding to face his pain with confidence. He knew that the path of faith was not the easiest, but it was the truest. This was the moment when trust in God became a force that transcended reason, where conviction was stronger than silence. And even without the answers, Job was finding an inner strength that would keep him firm until the end of his journey. After a long period of silence, Job finally hears the voice of God. However, what he imagined would be a detailed explanation of his suffering was not what God offered him. Instead, God begins to ask deep questions that challenge Job's limited view of life and suffering. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Who set its measurements? These questions were not seeking an answer, but aimed at something deeper, inviting Job to reflect on the greatness and sovereignty of God, far beyond the personal pain he was facing. God's words were neither accusations nor justifications. They were invitations for Job to align himself with the heavenly perspective. God was not telling Job why he had suffered so much, but showing him who he is. Job's suffering now became a small detail within a much larger plan that Job could not fully comprehend. The divine questions, instead of alleviating his immediate pain, provoked in him a silent repentance and a growing understanding of God's immense wisdom. As God asked questions that pointed to the universe, to creation, and to his absolute dominion over everything, Job felt small. The pain of his loss still afflicted him, but God's questions invited him to step back and realize that suffering did not have to be understood on his own terms. He was being challenged to see his pain not as punishment, but as an opportunity to witness God's power manifesting in a way he had never considered before. The grandeur of God, which is revealed in the questions asked of Job, puts everything in perspective. What seemed to be the greatest tragedy of Job's life was now being interpreted through the lens of divine sovereignty. God did not give Job the answer he wanted, but he gave him something even more powerful, a glimpse of his magnitude, an invitation to trust in his infinite wisdom. Job was beginning to realize that suffering, no matter how inexplicable, fit into an eternal plan that only God fully understood. These questions did not come with explanations about Job's suffering, but with the intention of showing him that human understanding is limited in the face of God's sovereignty. Each of the questions made Job see himself more as a part of something much greater and more complex than he could have imagined. Job's suffering, though real and painful, began to be interpreted as an opportunity for him to perceive God's greatness. He was no longer so focused on his own wounds, but began to see the world and his own story in a new light. God's response was not a conventional answer. It did not bring the immediate comfort Job had expected, but it led him to a deeper spiritual revelation. God did not offer an explanation about the reasons for Job's suffering, but brought him a new understanding of his sovereignty and authority over all things. The divine questions not only humbled Job, but also elevated him to a new level of understanding and humility. He began to realize that God is the center of everything, and that even in silence, he is working in ways we cannot see. Job finally began to understand that his pain was not outside of God's control. On the contrary, it was under the dominion of a God who, in his infinite wisdom, knew exactly what he was doing. Job's suffering then ceased to be something to be solved and became an experience of transformation. God, with his questions, was guiding him to a place of greater humility, where he could see the truth that divine sovereignty did not depend on explanations, but on trust in his power and perfect will. After hearing God's powerful questions, Job finally understands the extent of his limitation before the Creator. He realizes that, no matter how much he had suffered and questioned, he could never fully comprehend God's divine plans. The pain of his loss and the intensity of his suffering had led him to challenge God's silence, but now he finds himself repentant for this attitude. He acknowledges that, even without committing a specific sin, he questioned God's sovereignty, not realizing that in doing so, he was placing himself in a position of judgment that was not his to make. With a contrite heart, Job declares his inner decision. He repents of everything he said and did during his period of pain. He finally understands that his questions were not about what he truly knew, but about what he did not comprehend. "I had heard of you, but now my eyes see you," Job says, recognizing that until that moment he had known God only by hearsay, without truly understanding his greatness. This revelation brings him a deep understanding that true faith is not based on what is seen, but on what is believed. Job's repentance is not merely a simple confession, but an act of humility and surrender. He understands that God's sovereignty goes beyond the explanations he might have desired. As he looks at God's grandeur, Job realizes that his questions were driven by a limited view, a view that now begins to be broken. Job's faith, once shaped by the experience of suffering and doubt, now becomes purer, truer, grounded not in explanations, but in absolute trust in God. God's revelation to Job is not merely an intellectual understanding, but a spiritual experience that transforms his way of seeing life and pain. Job begins to perceive that God is not distant from his pain, but that he was in fact with him in every moment of suffering, even in the silence. Job's faith matures, and he now sees that by trusting in God, he is becoming part of a divine plan that goes beyond his human understanding. The pain which once made him question God himself now becomes the means by which he draws even closer to him. Job, now repentant, no longer seeks explanations for his suffering, but a deeper relationship with God. He understands that the true glory of God is not in the resolution of his problems, but in the revelation of his presence in the life of the faithful. God, in his infinite wisdom, does not just provide answers, but reveals himself in a personal and transformative way. Job's repentance is, in fact, an opening of the heart for a deeper experience of God's glory, a glory that he now begins to perceive not only in his mind, but also in his soul. God's silence, which once seemed like a sign of abandonment, is now seen by Job as part of the divine process of transformation. He no longer desires the answer, but the revelation of who God is in his full majesty. Job recognizes that his view of God until now was limited, a view that could only be expanded. Through the experience of pain and suffering, this new vision brings him peace, as he understands that God is not just someone to be understood, but to be revered, worshipped, and trusted. Job now finds himself in a place where his faith no longer depends on human explanations or answers. He has learned that true trust in God comes from recognizing his sovereignty, even without understanding all the details of suffering. Job's repentance, then, is a turning point where he exchanges his limited view of God for a broader and deeper vision. He fully surrenders to God, not because he understands everything, but because now he sees God with the eyes of faith. After Job's repentance and his surrender to God's sovereignty, the Lord in his infinite mercy begins to restore Job's life in a surprising way. The first great blessing Job experiences is the restoration of his health. His wounds, which once consumed him, are healed, and he feels renewed with vigor and energy restored. Job realizes that by being physically restored, he is not only being healed from his wounds, but he is being taken to a new level of understanding about divine care. His healing becomes a symbol that suffering, no matter how intense, is not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter of faith and trust. Furthermore, God brings back Job's family, but not in any ordinary way. His children are restored in such an extraordinary manner that the Lord gives him a new lineage, and his children who had passed away are now replaced by those who bring even more joy to his heart. The silence of God during his pain had seemed incomprehensible, but now in the restoration, Job sees that everything was part of a divine process aimed at preparing him to receive even more than he had lost. He sees that the loss was not the end, but a means to build a stronger, deeper faith that would be rewarded. The restoration of his possessions is also remarkable. The camels, oxen, and sheep he had before his loss return twofold. Job becomes even more prosperous than before. However, what truly stands out in this restoration is not the material wealth, but the profound understanding he acquires. Job now knows that true prosperity is not in the amount of riches, but in the peace that only God can provide. He sees that although his material possessions were restored, the true reward is the transformation of his heart and the restored intimacy with God. Job's honor, which was deeply shaken by Satan's attacks and the words of his friends, is also restored. The shame and humiliation he suffered when he was the target of unjust accusations dissipate, and God places him again in a position of respect and dignity. The restoration of Job's honor is not just a restitution of his social status, but a testimony that God is always in control, even when it seems we are being dishonored. God truly honors those who remain faithful to him, even in the darkest times. Now, looking at his restored life, Job understands that the silence of God, which troubled him so much during his trial, was never an absence of his presence, but a means of preparation for something greater. He reflects on how, before all the pain, he had a limited view of God's goodness. After the suffering and restoration, he has a broader and deeper view of God's love. The experience of pain and silence prepared him for a new level of understanding and intimacy with the Lord. The restoration of his life is not merely a return to what he had, but a new opportunity to live with a heart full of gratitude and reverence. Job's complete restoration becomes a powerful testimony to all those around him. Those who once saw him as someone punished and despised now see him being blessed and exalted by God. The change in his life is not just visible in his wealth or health, but in the way he now speaks of God's faithfulness. Job, who once questioned God's silence, now shares with others the greatness and faithfulness of the Lord, becoming a living example of unwavering faith and absolute trust in God. God then reveals to Job that the trial he went through was a test that, although painful, had a divine purpose of growth and transformation. Job realizes that the restoration of his life is much more than the simple return to what he had before. The Lord had used suffering to shape him so that he would be a person even more full of faith and gratitude. And now, with the restoration of his life, Job is stronger, more mature, and more aware of God's sovereignty in every aspect of his life. The silence of God was not abandonment, but a time of preparation for the greatest testimony of his glory. The story of Job teaches us that often in times of great pain, we feel that God is silent. Sometimes we are in the midst of suffering, seeking answers, praying and crying out, but nothing seems to change. Job experienced this silence, and, as distressing as it was, he discovered something that many of us also need to understand. God's silence does not mean he is not present. Perhaps in your life you are going through a time of pain and uncertainty, and you might wonder, where is God? Why is he not answering? But just like Job, the apparent absence of answers is not a sign of abandonment, but a time of preparation. God was working in Job's life in a way that he could not understand at that moment. The same may be true for you. Perhaps in the silence, God is shaping your character, strengthening your faith, or even preparing you for something greater, something you cannot yet see. In the midst of suffering, it may feel like we are alone, but God is still writing our story. He has a plan, even if we cannot see it clearly now. God's silence is not a punishment, but an invitation to trust and patience. It can be hard to believe this when the pain is intense, but the story of Job shows that in the end, God not only restores what was lost, but he does so in a glorious way and double. Job saw his life transformed, his health restored, and his faith renewed. He learned that God is not absent, but is teaching us to trust in him through pain, knowing that his timing and his ways are perfect. Sometimes God's silence is a time of spiritual growth, an opportunity to strengthen our trust in him regardless of circumstances. And it is in this silence that we are invited to develop a more mature faith, a faith that does not depend on immediate answers or favorable circumstances, but a faith that stands on the certainty that God is in control. He knows every detail of our lives, and nothing happens without his permission. Your pain and silence are not ignored by God. Perhaps you are going through a difficult situation now, where answers seem to be delayed, where distress is great, and the questions about the purpose of pain remain unanswered. But remember, like Job, you can declare with faith, "I know that my Redeemer lives." Even if answers do not come immediately, or if the suffering feels endless, faith in God allows us to look beyond the pain and trust that He has a greater purpose for our lives. In this moment, the invitation is for you not to give up on faith, even when God's silence seems unbearable. Like Job, you can choose to trust even without understanding. God's silence might be the fertile ground where He is planting something new in you. He is shaping your life, your story, and He will be faithful to restore what was lost. Keep hope alive, for in due time your faith will be rewarded. Job's story does not end with pain but with restoration, and your story will not end in pain either. Therefore, if you find yourself in the midst of silence, remember that God is not absent. He is still writing your story, and His answer will come at the right time. Even in the silence, He is near you, hearing every prayer and watching every step. Today's suffering will not be the end, but the beginning of a new chapter of faith, trust and restoration. If you keep trusting, soon you will see how God will turn your pain into victory. So keep going, even in the silence, for the story that God is writing is much bigger than you can imagine.